Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who are new to our community, my name is John Sexton. I'm the president of New York University. We sometimes refer to this university as the Global Network University, and as I introduce this morning's important proceedings, I find that label quite real and palpable, because less than 48 hours ago, I was introducing in Abu Dhabi a panel with two Wagner professors that was to discuss in that context their view of President Obama's first year. Needless to say, in their quite positive assessment of that first year, in a context where I should say there was high appreciation for the efforts of the president, the tremendous challenges that have come to confront this administration were discussed at length. Over there, the phrase was used that perhaps no president, including the three which would come to mind, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt, perhaps no president, even those three, had ever been confronted with such a broad and deep set of challenges as confronted this administration as it moved into office about a year ago. One very, very big cause for optimism about our ability as a nation to confront those problems is the fact that the president has brought around him an extraordinarily talented group of extremely dedicated public servants. And it is one of those extraordinarily talented people who comes to our campus today, again, under the sponsorship of the university and Wagner, to discuss with us some of the extraordinary array of challenges with which he deals. I've had the privilege of observing the work of Peter and knowing him for several years. You can trace, notwithstanding his young age, you can trace his positive mark on American policy back. I was absolutely delighted when Strobe Talbot, the head of the Brookings Institute and a good friend, suggested a few years ago that Brookings and NYU partner, both in New York and Washington, and that Brookings create a presence here in the Wagner School, and that one of the people that would be part of that presence was this extraordinary young man of whom I knew, Peter Orszag. So there's a way in which today we're welcoming him home. There's a way in which today we are saying that we as a nation, we as a people who care about the advancement of the world, we as a people who care about the use of government to do good, are here, Peter, to help. We begin that by providing, very simply, a platform for you and some conversation that might help you advance in your thinking. But most of all, we want you to know that we are there for you with all of the assets and talents of this university, because we are there for the country. Our motto, a private university in the public service, is real today, just as is the feeling that I have that around the world, the eyes are on what this administration is doing, and the hopes and prayers, not just of the nation, but of the world, are with you. With that, I will turn it over to an extraordinary dean, Ellen Schall, who is formally the host for today.
Thank you, John. And before I start, a salute to another John Bradamus, the former president of the university, and of course a former congressman and an incredible public servant himself. As dean of the Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at NYU, which, as John said, describes itself as a private university in the public service, I am delighted to be able to introduce you to a quintessential public servant, Peter Orszag, a man who has devoted his career to solving and resolving important public issues. It was exactly a year ago today, and remember to vote if you haven't yet and you're registered in New York, that we elected Barack Obama as the 44th President of the United States. And very soon after that, President Obama nominated Peter Orszag as the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. In a team with so much new energy and youth, Peter Orszag is the youngest member of President Obama's team holding cabinet rank. Described as pretty much brilliant, Peter did his undergrad work at Princeton, from which he graduated summa cum laude, and went on to the London School of Economics, from which he received both a master's and a PhD in economics. He was a Marshall Scholar and also Phi Beta Kappa. What distinguishes him among brilliant economists, though, is his equally sophisticated and nuanced understanding of politics and policy. Peter schooled himself in these subjects, although he had very good mentors along the way. He was a senior fellow and deputy director of economic studies at the Brookings Institution. He served as special assistant to the president for economic policy and as senior economist and senior advisor in the Council of Economic Advisors during the Clinton administration. And he was director of the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. Quite an amazing record. Add to that Peter's stint as a visiting scholar at NYU, where he was generous with his time and his wisdom, and for which we are ever grateful, and it's unbeatable. He's here today to discuss rescue, recovery, and reining in the deficit. I'm thrilled to present to you the brilliant, the savvy, the young, the marathon running, the hip director of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, Peter Orszag.
Thank you, Ellen. As LBJ once said, that's the kind of introduction that my father would appreciate and my mother would believe. I'm delighted to be back here at NYU. I'm particularly delighted as the budget director to be speaking at the university founded by Albert Gallatin, not only because he was a distinguished public servant, though he was, but also because he accomplished something that has been very difficult to accomplish then or since. He moved the nation from deficit to surplus, which as OMB director, I particularly appreciate. Now, some may say that's the reason that Albert Gallatin has a statue in the place of honor in front of the Treasury Department on Pennsylvania Avenue, whereas his better-known predecessor, Alexander Hamilton, is relegated to the South Side. I think, however, I've come upon the true answer. Hamilton went to Columbia. In reviewing the challenges that Hamilton, Gallatin, and their colleagues faced, it's striking how many of the same issues arise today. How to handle the nation's finances, how much to invest in higher education, how much to spend on infrastructure, and how much to invest in our military. And just by looking at the end result of their plans, from the Louisiana Purchase to this great university, it's clear that in making these decisions about these consequential issues, those leaders had future generations in mind. This is the responsibility that each subsequent generation of Americans must live up to build an economy that is strong, vibrant, and able to sustain our future in a stable and sustainable way. All of us are keenly aware of the immediate struggles that we face because of the economic crisis that we experienced over the past year to two. I'm sure many of your families are facing excruciating choices that even a few years ago would have seemed unimaginable. But what may be less appreciated is the long-term impact of the crisis that we've been experiencing on our economy, on our fiscal future, and on the nation itself. So as we move from rescuing the economy to rebuilding it, we need to keep these long-term effects in mind, because only by keeping them firmly in mind will we be able to build a new foundation for stable economic activity. I want to say a few words about this and then reserve plenty of time for your questions. Let me start by reviewing where we've been. Last year, in the fourth quarter of 2008, real GDP declined at an annualized rate of more than 6%. In that quarter alone, household net worth fell by a stunning $5 trillion, dropping at an annual rate of 30%. In terms of employment, the fourth quarter experienced a loss of 1.7 million jobs, the largest since the end of World War II, and a number unfortunately only exceeded by the subsequent quarter, in which 2.1 million jobs were lost. This slowdown in economic activity created a pair of trillion-dollar deficits. The first was the budget deficit. The projected fiscal year 2009 deficit amounted to $1.3 trillion even before President Obama first walked into the Oval Office. The second deficit, the so-called GDP gap, was the deficit between how much the economy could produce and how much it was producing. That was estimated also to amount to about 7% of the economy, or roughly another $1 trillion gap. To a degree that we had not experienced in more than half a century, we needed to bring the economy back from the brink. The first step was to restore confidence in the financial system, and we initiated several programs to stabilize conditions in financial markets. I'm happy to report that the sense of crisis in financial markets seems to have passed, and we now are therefore focusing our efforts on providing assistance to responsible families, allowing them to keep their homes, and granting small businesses better access to credit so that they can expand their activities and become an engine of economic activity. Beyond boosting confidence and stabilizing financial markets, the second step was to bolster macroeconomic demand, jump-starting economic activity and avoiding the potentially vicious recessionary cycle that could otherwise have taken hold. In light of the massive GDP gap that we faced, the administration and the Congress moved quickly to enact the $787 billion Recovery Act just 28 days after taking office. That's much more rapid action than the so-called inside lag that academic economists typically say government policymakers can accomplish. And over the past 8 months, the Recovery Act has made a significant difference. For example, estimates suggest that the bill added 3 to 4 percentage points to economic growth during the third quarter of this year. And last week, we learned that real GDP growth in that third quarter was 3.5%. In other words, effectively all the growth in real GDP during the third quarter could be attributable, either directly or indirectly, to the Recovery Act. Now, to economists, these statistics provide some degree of comfort. But let's be very clear. To the millions of Americans who remain out of work and want to work, they are cold comfort. Far too many workers who would rather be earning a paycheck are instead forced to accept unemployment. And too many American families are struggling with choices about how to pay the mortgage, meet their food and other bills, send their children to college, and find another job. Unfortunately, even as the economy begins to turn around, the employment picture isn't going to brighten immediately, as the contrast between the recently reported GDP numbers and the unemployment figures that will be out later this week underscore. The sad fact is that unemployment lags a general recovery, and as the President has said repeatedly, the coming months will be difficult ones for American workers. The typical progression in a recovery is first an increase in productivity growth, then an increase in hours worked among already employed workers, and then only finally an increase in hiring by firms. We are somewhere between the first and second stage of that process. In the second quarter of this year, productivity surged by more than 6% on an annualized basis, and our estimates suggest that the third quarter will show roughly the same figure. Although the month-to-month change in aggregate hours has not yet turned consistently positive, its decline has moderated from the depths of last fall and winter. And when that does change, we will then be firmly in the second stage of the process. Now, we have seen this before. As the economy picks up, jobs are ultimately created, and those who are unemployed will go back to work. Unfortunately, that process takes time, and even when unemployment starts to pick up again, it's not the end of the story. That's because a new body of social science literature demonstrates that an economic downturn has a lasting impact on workers and their families even after recovery itself sets in. Consider the effects of what economists call an exogenous labor shock, but normal people call a layoff, on the life course not of those laid off, but on their children. A range of studies have found that having a parent laid off, become unemployed, is associated with effects on high school graduation rates, college enrollment rates, the employment rate after college, and even how much you get paid in a new job after graduating. And the effect is persistent, with higher high school dropout rates and lower college enrollment rates evident even years later. Reflecting this, the children of workers who were once laid off have lower average career earnings as adults than otherwise similar workers whose parents were not laid off. Now, I'd also note the long-term repercussions of an economic downturn are evident not just among those whose immediate families experience unemployment, but unfortunately also among a broader pool of people, including those who are initially entering the workforce, the rising generation of workers. The adverse effect of entering the labor force during an economic downturn imposes a drag on career earnings that goes far beyond the duration of the recession itself. One recent study, for example, found that graduating during a period of high unemployment leads to depressed initial wages. Every percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, for example, is associated with 6% lower wages upon graduation. This negative wage effect declines only slowly over time, to 5% after 5 years, 4% after 10 years, and 3% even 15 years after graduation. Now remember, that's for every percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. When most of today's NYU seniors first entered the university, the unemployment rate was about 5 percentage points lower than it is today. You can do the math. Another way of looking at it, when one compares graduates in 1982, a peak unemployment year, to those who graduated in 1988, a peak employment year, the difference in wages over the first 20 years of a career in present value amounts to $100,000. The evidence thus suggests that a recession hits young people particularly hard, and it knocks them off course for years to come. Now, I know there are a lot of students in the audience, and I hope I haven't depressed you. There is a silver lining, which is the evidence suggests that these so-called recession graduates are also more likely to go on to both to college and to graduate school. And the evidence is unambiguous that the more you learn, the more you earn. So the bottom line is that one of the key motivations for the administration and the Congress acting so forcefully to try to mitigate the economic downturn is to mitigate the long-term repercussions of that downturn on, for example, graduating seniors. The other lesson is that we need to invest in education, especially so that those workers who are on the crucial first rung of the career ladder have the tools that they need to move up that ladder as the economy recovers. And that's why the administration has taken a number of steps to open up college to more Americans. To make college more affordable, we passed into law the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which provides a $4,000 tax credit for college students. And in July, the President put forward the American Graduation Initiative, a $12 billion initiative over the next decade that will help community colleges, as well as innovative strategies to help students complete college, because a key problem that we face is that many students who enter college do not complete their degree. In addition, we have undertaken a series of reforms to simplify the dreaded FAFSA, the application form for student aid, and anyone who has interacted with that form knows what I'm talking about. This form is more complicated than a tax return, and it's a huge obstacle for many worthy students who want to attend college. To get a sense of how big a barrier this is, remember that most of the items on that form are based off of your tax return. Recently, a randomized experiment was conducted in which a tax preparation firm took a subset of students, helped them fill out their FAFSA form by pre-populating it with the items, the information from the tax return, and then provided quick assistance to fill out the additional questions. The results are startling. Those who were provided such assistance to get over the complexity of the form had a 30% increase not only in the application, which may not be surprising, but a 30% increase in college enrollment itself. We increased college enrollment rates by 30% among a low and moderate income household population simply by providing more assistance in obtaining the aid that was already available. And the administration is acting on evidence like that to dramatically simplify the FAFSA form for all Americans, not just those who participated in that experiment. In addition to these direct efforts, we've also helped schools indirectly by providing roughly $140 billion in the Recovery Act in state fiscal relief. Over the last 3 or 4 decades, state budgets have been increasingly squeezed by a variety of forces, including rising healthcare costs, and their support for higher education, as a result, has come under pressure. One of the main motivations for that $140 billion in the Recovery Act is to help state governments avoid cutting back dramatically on support for higher education in the face of the current fiscal problems that they have. This interplay among squeezed budgets, higher college tuition rates, cuts in services, and the effect this has on young people's earnings, as well as on economic growth, is just one manifestation of the long-term effects of fiscal strain. And that takes me to another consequence of the financial and economic meltdown that we have experienced, the impact it has had on our fiscal situation. Just a few weeks ago, the administration released the year-end statement of the federal government, a final accounting of what we took in and what we spent during fiscal year 2009, which ended in September. The results were not a surprise, but they were nonetheless sobering. The deficit for the last fiscal year was $1.4 trillion, or 10% of our economy. Next year's deficit is expected to be about the same size, and current projections show $9 trillion in deficits over the next decade, averaging about 5% of GDP. Deficits of this size are serious and ultimately unsustainable. So how did we get here? If you look at that $9 trillion in projected deficits over the coming decade, nearly $5 trillion comes from failing to pay for 2 policies, the Medicare prescription drug benefit and the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. The cost of the tax cuts will add about $4 trillion over the next decade, including the interest that we must pay on the additional debt because they were deficit financed. The Medicare prescription drug bill will add another $700 billion to the deficit, bringing us to $5 trillion from failing to finance those 2 policies alone. In addition, roughly $3.5 trillion can be attributed to the so-called automatic stabilizers. When the economy weakens, spending on programs like unemployment benefits and food stamps naturally increase. And in addition, revenue declines. Although this helps to mitigate the decline in aggregate demand and therefore is crucial to bolstering economic activity, it also leads to higher deficits. Finally, there is the Recovery Act, which accounts for only 10% of that projected deficit over the next decade, despite what you may have heard to the contrary. All told then, the entire $9 trillion projected deficit can be attributed to either the failure to pay for policies in the past or the cost of the current economic downturn and the measures that we have had to adopt to combat it. Now, assigning blame never solves a problem, but I do think it is important to understand that we didn't get where we are merely as a result of bad luck. It was the result of decisions, conscious but unfortunate, and it will take deliberate action for us to work our way out of the problem. It's critically important that we do just that. Over the long term, deficits have one of 2 effects. First, they can raise interest rates and cause a decline in investment as the federal government goes into the credit markets and competes with private borrowers. Alternatively, deficits can increase the amount that the United States borrows from abroad as foreigners step in to finance our borrowing. Either way, whether deficits increase interest rates and cause a decline in investment, or they cause an increase in borrowing from abroad, the long-term effect is the same. It generates a burden on you, our future workers. If interest rates rise and investment declines, then productivity in the future is lower than it would otherwise be because you don't have as much computers and other equipment with which to work. And if we borrow more from abroad as a result of our deficits, that means more of your future incomes will have to be mortgaged to pay back our foreign creditors. Now, from a quick look at the financial pages, you might think that what I'm saying is belied by the facts. Even as the deficit has reached a record level, interest rates are very low. For example, if you look at the nominal interest rate on the Treasury's 10-year note, so far this year it's averaged roughly 3%. If that continues through the rest of the year, it will be the lowest average nominal interest rate since the 1950s. At the same time, and in just 3 years, the current account has fallen dramatically. Current account is a reflection of how much we borrow from abroad, declining from about 6% of GDP in 2006 to under 3% now. These seemingly conflicting trends, rising deficits but low interest rates and a decline in the current account deficit, are a product of the extraordinary economic environment in which we currently find ourselves. Right now, the federal government, in effect, is not competing with other borrowers for capital. Let's look at the facts. Among households and non-financial businesses, total borrowing peaked at about 15% of GDP in 2006 and has since fallen to minus 3% of GDP in the second quarter. In other words, people in non-financial businesses went from borrowing about a seventh of the economy to, on net now, paying back loans. What about the financial sector? There, the results are even more dramatic. Financial sector businesses went from borrowing an amount equivalent to about 10% of GDP as of 2006 to paying back about 15% of GDP in the second quarter as the financial crisis has forced these companies to deleverage. Public sector borrowing has increased dramatically, but by a smaller amount than the decline in private borrowing. As a result, total borrowing, public and private combined, has gone from roughly 30% of GDP in 2006 to effectively zero today. That's why interest rates remain low and the current account deficit has declined. In essence, the private sector's demand for capital has collapsed, and the United States Treasury is the sole borrower left standing. The problem, however, is that at some point, as the economy recovers and other borrowers return to the market because of increased consumer spending and business investment picking up, the federal government's borrowing to finance its deficits will be competing more directly with the private sector for capital. It's at that point that we are likely to observe the deleterious effects from deficits that I mentioned: an increase in interest rates, an increase in borrowing from abroad, or some combination thereof. And it's at that point that the deficits will shift from providing assistance to the economy during a period of exceptional economic weakness to putting the economy in jeopardy because they are robbing future workers of form of income. So while we have been addressing our short-term economic crisis, what are we doing to address this longer-term problem? Perhaps most importantly, we are taking on the biggest threat to our long-term fiscal future, healthcare costs. Our fiscal future is so dominated by the rate at which healthcare costs grow that if we succeed in reducing that growth rate by just 15 basis points, that is to say 0.15 percentage points per year, the effect is equivalent to eliminating the entire long-term deficit in Social Security. Right now, we are further along toward our goal of fiscally responsible health reform than ever before. I believe that in the weeks to come, the President will sign legislation that not only provides stability to those already with health insurance and expands coverage to those who lack it, but that also does so while boosting quality and reducing long-term deficits. Let me be clear. Any bill that the President will sign must reduce the deficit over the long term and not add to it over the next decade. This will be done through a belt and suspenders approach. That is, we're relying on hard, scorable savings, as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, to pay for health reform. And we are not looking, at least for that purpose, to the potentially much more important cost savings that will come from transforming the healthcare delivery system. In this way, the worst case scenario is that we have reformed healthcare and paid for it. But because we're also taking substantial steps to transform the healthcare system over time, reform will also undoubtedly help to improve our long-term fiscal footing, albeit to a degree that is very difficult to quantify. Once health reform is passed, however, the job of getting our nation back on a fiscally sustainable course will not be complete. Our current projections of 4 to 5% of GDP in out-year deficits are well above the fiscally sustainable level of roughly 3% of GDP. To bring deficits down to a sustainable range, therefore, will require more action once the economy is into a recovery. We are currently considering a number of proposals to put our country back on firm fiscal footing and to cut the deficit we inherited in half by the end of the President's first term. In the meantime, in addition to reforming healthcare, we have taken steps to start changing the culture in Washington to boost efficiency and make sure taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and effectively. For example, we've undertaken a number of reforms to federal contracting to try to curtail the number of no-bid contracts and ultimately save up to $40 billion a year by wringing more efficiencies out of the way we undertake our contracting. Additionally, upon the recommendation of Secretary Gates and the military leadership, we have identified a variety of weapon systems that were doing little to make our nation safe, that the Pentagon didn't want, but that nonetheless were costing the Treasury billions. In fact, this year, the President worked with Senator McCain and members from both parties to stop further production of the F-22 fighter jet, a feat that many in Washington believed would not be possible to accomplish. Time and again, those folks in Washington had said we could not do this, and if you look at the record, that is indeed what we have accomplished. And after years of failing to abide by the simple principle that you should pay for what you spend, the administration has proposed statutory pay-as-you-go legislation, otherwise known as PAYGO. This embodies the simple principle that when you propose a new tax cut or a new spending program, you should offset its cost, a principle that we are abiding by with regard to health reform legislation. And I'd note that in the 1990s, this common sense approach helped to move the nation from large deficits into surpluses. And again, its absence, as I mentioned earlier, accounts for $5 trillion of that projected $9 trillion deficit that we face over the next decade. These are all important steps to help improve efficiency, rein in waste, and create a government that works better. But these steps alone will not fill the shortfall that we face, which is why I, along with the rest of the economics team, are busy working on a range of options that we will put forward as part of the fiscal year 2011 budget to be released in February. As we look to the future then, there is much work we need to do today to lay a new stable economic foundation for future economic growth. We must give a hand up to those entering the workforce, enabling them to get the schooling they need so that they can counter the headwinds of the recession that we've been experiencing. And as the economy recovers, we must pull together as a nation and make the tough decisions necessary to put the nation back on a solid fiscal foundation. None of this will be easy. After all, it took us years to dig ourselves into the current fiscal hole, and it will take years for us to find our way out of it. But I, again, along with the President and the rest of the administration, are committed to making our way responsibly and rapidly out of that hole. That's what the founder of this university did when he was helping to lead our young nation at the start of the 19th century. And that's precisely what we must do at the start of the 21st. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to take your questions.
Thank you, Peter. That was a tour de force. If we had known, we would have arranged for college credit. The mics are on either side of the room. Let's start over here.
Question that I have about the amount of money that we spend on Iraq, Afghanistan, and other Middle East areas. How much is that? And how much of an impact does that make on the deficit? And if we were, forgive me, I'm going to ask you serious. And if we were to cut certain amount of the spending of the rebuilding of the electrical plants in Iraq and other places, could we use that money for healthcare reform?
So let me first say, just factually, the cost of what is referred technically to as overseas contingency operations amounts to roughly $10 to $15 billion a month. It depends exactly how you're doing the accounting. But I want to emphasize the most important thing with regard to those operations is a security and foreign policy perspective, which the President and the National Security Team are bringing to bear on those questions. It does cost money. I would note that one of the reasons that we are seeking efficiencies in the base budget from the Pentagon and are so pleased that we have succeeded, for example, with regard to the F-22, is that whatever we are spending, we should make sure we're doing as efficiently and effectively as possible. So I don't want to get into the debate, a foreign policy debate. I have enough on my plate. But with regard to making sure that whatever dollars are devoted to our military, that we're getting as much for them, we are very focused on that question.
You've expressed some support for some kind of bipartisan Senate deficit reduction commission that would combine tax increases and spending cuts. Could you give an example of maybe 2 to 3 tax increases that you think would be regressive enough to satisfy Senate Republicans, but wouldn't breach President Obama's promise not to raise taxes on households making less than $250,000 a year? Thank you.
No. Well, let me just say, we face a series of very difficult questions that we are sorting through as part of the fiscal year 2011 budget process. You started your question with regard to a discussion of commissions. And there are many people who are discussing many things, both in terms of proposals and processes that will move us towards that fiscally sustainable out-year path that we must get to. There's going to be much more to say, but one of the things that I've learned in moving from places like NYU into the government is that there are certain things that are best left for the process itself, and we're in the midst of doing that.
Hi, Merrill Frank, Transportation Planner with NIMTEC, the regional MPO. Whatever happened to revenue sharing? Used to be a common item up until the Reagan administration. And Senator Moynihan used to come out with his report every year, how much New York sent to Washington and how little it got back. The latest stat is we send $1 to Washington, we get 84 cents back. Alaska sends $1, they get $1.84 back. And also a robust transportation bill would do a lot to improve efficiencies in the economy and spur productivity.
Let me start with the revenue sharing. Again, I mentioned the $140 billion in state fiscal relief that was part of the Recovery Act. The motivation behind revenue sharing, I guess there are 2 different dimensions. One is within the federal income tax system, how much is, and federal expenditures, how much is coming and going from various states. That's one set of questions. Revenue sharing itself was a form of sharing resources with state and local governments that existed 20, 30 years ago and that is often talked about but it is not embodied in current law. If you look at state government finances over a long period of time, one of the key trends that has occurred, and I mentioned this briefly during the talk, is rising Medicaid costs in particular have crowded out other expenditures, including state government support for higher education. And you would not, this is a motivation for making the healthcare system more efficient. If I told you today that rising healthcare costs, I'll tell you a little story. Rising healthcare costs have crowded out state government support for higher education, public higher education. The result has been that tuition has gone up. Everyone knows that. However, tuition has not gone up sufficiently, even though it's been very painful, to offset the decline in state government support. The result is that spending per student at private universities relative to public universities has declined dramatically over the past 20 or 30 years. If you look at comparison universities, Stanford and Berkeley, UT Austin and Rice and what have you, one of the manifestations of this is that 20 or 30 years ago, starting assistant professor salaries at the private university and the otherwise comparable public university were roughly the same. They're now 20 or 30% lower at the public universities. If you observe that trend, this growing divergence in starting assistant professor salaries, you would not trace that back to rising healthcare costs, but ultimately that is the cause. And that's one reason why we're so focused on moving towards a more efficient healthcare system over time.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a Wagner student, and I saw you on the Daily Show, and I thought it was really awesome. So I'm just
there's a lot of downside risk in going on those shows, let me just say.
No, but I'm just wondering if you could maybe help the urban economics class. I'm going to get tickets after our midterm. Which is next
Not
week.
sure that's within the ethics rules.
But I have a serious question, which is you've forecasted that Medicare, Medicaid costs might be 20% of the GDP by 2050, up from 5% now, so 5 to 20%. And I'm just wondering how your office is evaluating investment in wellness care and prevention to reverse that trend.
Well, let me try to go broader than just prevention and wellness and say one of the things that in order to move towards a healthcare system that, that avoids the 20% of GDP by 2050, there are many things that have to happen. It is stunning that healthcare has much less digitized information than virtually any other industry. The Recovery Act included a huge investment in moving towards health information technology becoming more universal, and we're in the midst of finalizing the regulations that will help, or not finalizing, but putting out the regulations that will help in rolling out that health IT money. We also need to be much more aggressively looking at what works and what doesn't, and both the House and Senate health legislation includes funding for so-called comparative effectiveness research to be examining what works and what doesn't. And then we need to be moving the payment system towards better quality care rather than more care. Right now we pay for more care, that's what we get. Both the House legislation and the legislation that's been considered by the Senate committees move towards paying for quality rather than paying for intensity. We need to do that. And then finally, to your point, right now the healthcare system is focused on treating illness rather than making people healthier. And part of what we need to do is move towards a system in which we are just as focused on diet, exercise, stress, all the other elements of health beyond just what has traditionally been viewed as healthcare. And I'll just note briefly, one of the things the president has encouraged is wellness programs, which many corporations have, but have been largely lacking in the federal government. And we're trying to replicate many of the things that are the best practices in the private sector. Even at OMB, in fact, I'm wearing it. I am wearing my pedometer. We have issued a pedometer challenge at OMB. Unfortunately, when I signed up for this, I didn't realize that there were a bunch of OMB employees who were running marathons in the fall. And as a result, instead of being in the top 20 or 30, which is where I was hoping to be, I'm something like number 70 or 80. But the point is, the president is strongly encouraging not only the prevention and wellness elements that are in the health legislation itself, but the federal government itself to move towards the kinds of wellness programs that are common among many employers.
Great.
Hi, sir. My name is Paul. I work for the New York City government, and I guess in honor of today being election day, everyone needs to go vote today. What role do you see cities playing in the recovery, and what do you think are the most pressing problems facing American cities, and what policies do you think the Obama administration might take to address those?
Well, that question has multiple layers. The first layer is that cities, like state governments, have been hard hit by the economic downturn. And in addition to the long-term repercussions for younger workers and for others from a severe economic downturn, an additional motivation to be acting so aggressively is the impact that a downturn has on state and local governments, which I think we are all seeing play out in the newspapers as both state and local governments face very difficult choices. One of the reasons, again, coming back to the $140 billion in relief that was provided as part of the Recovery Act, part of that flows down to local governments through the state government. And in fact, if you look at the employment numbers that are coming out of the Recovery Act, a very significant share of the jobs saved or created that are being reported are among teachers, which, as you all know, are primarily supported by local governments. So the first layer, in fact, I mean, there are structural issues that I'll turn to in a second, but the first layer is to promote economic recovery. In addition to that, one of the things that we're doing as part of the fiscal year 2011 budget process is examining what's called place-based policies. That is, policies that are focused on particular geographic areas as opposed to more generalized policies. For the first time, we're taking an inventory of the policies that the federal government has to encourage, whether through empowerment zones, there are a whole variety of policies trying to encourage economic activity at the local level, and trying to bring a cross-cutting look to make sure we're investing as effectively as possible. But again, I think the first order thing, the most important thing, is to get the economy back on its feet.
Let's try to have one-part questions, because we have a lot of people eager to ask questions.
All right, well, you stole my thunder. Hi, my name is David, and I'm a student at the Wagner School as well. Thank you for coming to speak with us today. I guess the most important question I had then was about healthcare cost, like drivers of healthcare cost inflation, because there's been a lot of talk about bending the cost curve, and you talked about comparative effectiveness research to that end, like helping to reduce costs. But what are some of what would you identify as the main drivers of healthcare cost inflation? And then what are some policies that would limit the drivers, especially in thinking about like compensation based on fee-for-service models?
It's a simple question.
Yeah. There are a variety of ways of answering that, and to get technical, one needs to be careful about the rate, cost growth as opposed to the level of cost. But let me just answer it this way. There have been a variety of studies suggesting very significant improvements that can be obtained in reducing costs without harming quality, the quality of care delivered. Estimates from the Institute of Medicine, for example, suggesting $800 or $900 billion a year in healthcare services delivered that don't actually make people healthier. And similar estimates coming from Dartmouth and from private sector consulting. When you look at the sources of that figure, it typically reflects a combination of things. Again, we have a healthcare system in which there's very substantial variation in the way healthcare is practiced, and much of the variation doesn't seem to be backed by scientific evidence that a more intensive approach is always better. So one of the things that we need to make sure is that a doctor has the best possible information on what will work and incentives to providing high quality care. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. No, we're going to move on.
Hi, my name is Arthur. I'm actually a member of the Concord Coalition, and
I've heard of it.
I've followed these issues. I'm very happy to see someone like yourself in this position. But I was listening to how you've outlined the threat of stagnant growth on one side, but also the threat of the debt that we have to service with the possibility of interest payments squeezing out what we prioritize our spending on. In looking at how the administration will have to work with Congress on these things, how does, what is the kind of the political climate outside of or after healthcare reform that can be brought to bear, that priorities can be set on spending to stimulate growth in areas, but also turn attention to deficit reducing objectives?
Well, I think this is a key question, and one way of looking at it is we want to avoid the mistakes of the past. If you look back, for example, at the Great Depression, a key policy mistake that was made was taking off fiscal stimulus too quickly, causing the 1937 reversal that was arguably unnecessary. So avoiding that, but on the other hand, we have these out-year deficits in 2013, 2014, 2015, and what have you, that are unsustainably high. And as a colleague of mine once put it, imagine trying to write a business plan in which you're planning for rapid growth over the next 2 or 3 years and then a dramatic decline thereafter. It's very complicated to try to make the pieces fit together, which is precisely what we are trying to do as part of the fiscal year 2011 budget. You also asked about the external appetite. I think you are seeing, both in the Senate and the House, attention shifting to our out-year deficits. So we have an immediate crisis that remains necessary to tend to. We also have a key policy initiative that needs to be done in a fiscally responsible way, healthcare. But beyond that, I do think that there's a significant coalition within the Congress to turn to this issue after we get through healthcare reform. And that's what the President has said we need to do.
Thank you.
My name is Gail, and my question also has to do with the state and localities. In addition to the loss of revenue, many state, county, and local governments and the agencies have accrued substantial losses because they invested in swaps and other derivatives during boom times. Now, to a degree, the stimulus has cushioned this. You're getting places like Jefferson County in Alabama and Beaver County in Pennsylvania that are skirting on the edge of bankruptcy. What do you see as the impact of this once a stimulus is lifted, and what are the thoughts of the administration on how we're going to deal with these as more and more of these things come to light?
Well, I'm going to go back again and say the thing that we are most focused on is getting the economy back on its feet and spurring job creation, because, again, that will help not only everyone in the room, but and not only the federal government, but state and local governments also. Beyond that, I'm not going to say very much more other than to note we constantly monitor the situation at the state and local level and are cognizant of the appropriate role of the federal government versus state and local governments for their own well-being. That's a delicate line that needs to be respected.
Hi, my name is Ohm. I'm a politics major here, a sophomore. I just had a question that was similar to many other questions that were asked. I've heard numbers that by 2050 we're going to have, unfunded entitlements about $40 trillion, and majority of that will actually be coming from Social Security. How are we supposed to account for this, and what would you say we should do? Should we reform it? Should we raise taxes? What are we supposed to do?
Well, first let me say, actually, just on the facts, a far larger driver of our long-term fiscal gap than Social Security needs to be addressed. It does face a long-term imbalance, and it will need to be, that will need to be eliminated. But a far larger impact on our fiscal future is Medicare and Medicaid. So again, the question earlier correctly noted that if healthcare costs over the next 4 decades rise at the same rate as they did over the previous 4, Medicare and Medicaid go from it's now about 6% of GDP to 20% by 2050. Over the same period, that's roughly 15% of GDP increase. Over the same period of time, Social Security expenditures go up by about 2 or 2.5% of GDP. So a much larger issue. In a sense, to a first approximation, although there are other issues that will need to be addressed for the medium term, and although we do need to deal with Social Security, the single most important factor affecting our fiscal outcome in 2050 is the rate at which healthcare costs grow, which is why, as part of these bills that are moving through the Congress, there is an infrastructure that's being put in place, both through health information technology, research into what works and what doesn't, changes in payment incentives, and wellness and prevention programs to try to move to a different future for the healthcare system. Because if we don't do that, even eliminating the deficit in Social Security won't get us to where we need to be. And then with regard to how one can eliminate the deficit in Social Security, I've written books on that. I'm sure many people at NYU have written books on that. As we turn to that question, the various options that have been put forward in the past and by various respected organizations, including the Concord Coalition, will be a key part of the debate.
We're going to take this question and then Professor Kozlowski, and then, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to end. So.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Alice Labrie. I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service, and I'm here today as citizen taxpayer. Very quickly, both our mayoral candidates here in New York, Thompson and Bloomberg, have come out very strongly for technical and vocational schools. So I was curious if you had any comments, what's going on the federal level on recognizing that not everybody wants to go to college or can.
Well, let me say a couple things. One is that, and in fact, we have seen a spike in community college attendance over the past year or two, which is as expected during an economic downturn. You tend to, as I mentioned, recession graduates the silver lining is they tend to go on to school more. You're seeing that in community college. We are focused on, through Arnie Duncan and the Department of Education, transforming the educational piece of that, and then through the Department of Labor, there are a whole variety of job training programs that we are evaluating whether they can be improved in terms of how they work too. So from the federal government's perspective, we have actually, if anything perhaps, too many programs, both in education and in the Department of Labor, that deal with job training. And the question is whether we can make them work better by consolidation either on the education side or on the labor side. Final question.
Salo Kozlowski, a faculty at Wagner. And I would like to ask you to take a moment to take a step forward, so to speak, and thinking maybe 8 or 10 years from now when you're appointed the head of the World Bank. And you're tasked with promoting economic recovery and economic growth, not in the US, but in poor countries in Latin America and Africa and in Asia. And what kind of big lessons you're going to take with you from your current experience?
Wow. I think that one of the lessons, and you see this in much of what the World Bank does too, but that we are certainly very cognizant of, is what a former professor of mine called a hard-head but soft-hearted approach to policy. Concern for equality and opportunity, but also doing so in a rigorous way. And that combination of rigorous analysis, but also concern about, for example, whether low and moderate income students are going to college sufficiently, I think has much broader applicability than just the domestic issues that we are facing, and is at the core of what a lot of the international institutions also do. The only other lesson that I would suggest is that in many of these jobs, and I have enough problems as it is, I'm not looking for any future employment. The key thing is to be making forward progress. And I think if you look back just to review where we were a year ago, it is it is worth pausing, and it's not directly responsive to your question, but I would like to end on this note. Think back again to a year ago when President Obama was elected. The economy had a sense of free fall. Real GDP was declining by 6% or so on an annualized basis. I think if anyone told you at that point that credit spreads in the financial markets would be back to roughly normal levels, that real GDP would be growing by 3.5% in the third quarter, and that we would be this close to passing comprehensive health reform, which has not been accomplished in 50 years, they would probably look at you as if you were a little nuts. And yet that is indeed where we find ourselves, which is to say there's a lot more that needs to be done and significant work ahead, but I don't think we should lose sight of how far we've come in this, in this march. And so we will continue working hard, and much more to be done, but also a sense of how far we've come, I think, is appropriate at this moment. Thank you very much.